Indeed, we must restore the middle class as the backbone of a stronger, richer, and fairer America. Mr. President, with that I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. President. Earlier today we had a cloture vote on the nomination of Jack McConnell to be a United States District Judge for this Rhode Island. And 63 senators voted to cut off debate and to move then to a final vote on confirmation, which will occur, I'm told, around 5:30 shortly. But first, I wanted to come to the floor and expand a little bit on some of my earlier comments with regard to this nomination and why I am so strongly opposed to it. And just to make a few other comments. 33 years ago, I counted, I became a lawyer, a member of the legal profession. And while I've heard as many lawyer jokes as a person can stand in a lifetime, I'm actually proud of the legal profession. And what attracted me to it was its study of the law, the rule of law, and the majesty of law being made by elected representatives of the American people speaking for the American people themselves. A profession that observes a rule of ethics that is not just who can get the most the fastest, but one that actually requires lawyers to practice according to a standard of ethics. And then third, the obligation and the responsibility that comes with representing a client. In other words, it's not the lawyer who is speaking on their own behalf, but the lawyer who is speaking on behalf of a client, whether they've been arrested and charged with a crime, whether they've been injured in an accident and seeking compensation for some wrongdoing and to deter future acts, similar acts in the future, or it's a commercial dispute over a contract or some other relationship. I really believe that it is the rule of law and our adherence to ethical standards and the fact that the legal profession serves the interests of clients who need help, many of whom don't have a voice themselves, or certainly the capability of representing themselves, who need somebody who can help them. But I have to tell you that it is because of my respect for and admiration for the legal profession that it makes me angry when I see people making mockery out of the foundational principles I just mentioned, the rule of law, ethics, and the duty, fiduciary duty owed to a client. I had, after I practiced law for a while, I had the great honor of being elected to and serving as a district judge in my home city of San Antonio. So not only did I represent clients as an advocate in court, I had the responsibility of presiding over trials and making sure that people were treated impartially, the same, and according to the rule of law, that it was not a matter of who you were or how much money you had, but that everybody could have access to our system of justice. Later, I was honored to be elected to serve on the Texas Supreme Court for 7 years, where I was an appellate judge, and I wrote legal opinions basically grading the papers of some of those trial judges and making sure that indeed we had equal justice under the law. And then I was served as Attorney General for 4 years before I came here, during which time I became acquainted with a certain class of entrepreneurial lawyers that I think threatened the very rule of law that I have been talking about. I previously talked about my objections to Jack McConnell's nomination to serve and confirmation to serve as a federal judge because I believe he intentionally misrepresented certain facts before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Mr. McConnell and his firm have been sued in Ohio for stealing certain and maintaining custody of certain stolen documents in a lead paint lawsuit that I'll talk about here in a moment. And as a matter of fact, earlier today I introduced an article that demonstrates that that legal dispute still is raging and is not yet resolved. And yet the Senate is moving ahead and will likely confirm someone to a life tenure job as a federal judge who may ultimately be found responsible. I don't know. He could be vindicated. But why are we taking the risk that this individual who will be given a lifetime job as a federal judge might ultimately be found culpable in something that is certainly disqualifying if he is responsible for it? But I want to talk just a little bit more about, well, I want to tell a story. And I think it helps make the point I want to convey. Once upon a time, there was an enterprising lawyer and some of his law partners who were trying to figure a new way to make a lot of money. And they said, one of them said, well, I have a plan to do that. First, we have to pick a product or sector of the economy that is unpopular, even though it's legal. For example, tobacco. Exactly, one of the lawyers said. He said, we pick a product like tobacco, and we sue the manufacturers, and we make a lot of money. The problem is we've already tried to do that in individual lawsuits that are designed to compensate victims and deter wrongdoing, but we lost all of those lawsuits. Well, the enterprising young lawyer who suggested this plan said, we did, but now we have a new legal theory. We have a new approach. And legal theories that have never actually been embraced or accepted by the courts. And one of the other lawyers said, well, how does that work? What's the theory? To which the other responded, well, the theory really doesn't matter because this case will never be tried, but it will be settled for billions of dollars. And that takes us to the second part of the plan. The truth is the client or the person who would be represented is not an individual victim who is harmed as a result of some wrongdoing by a manufacturer of the product, but instead of that, it's the state, a state. How do you get hired to represent a state? Well, you got to get the Attorney General. My former job for 4 years. You've got to get the Attorney General, who's the chief law enforcement officer of the state, to basically hire you and then to delegate to you the sovereign law enforcement power of the state, in this case to sue the makers of a product. And part of this scheme is you sue not just for damages to one individual or group of individuals, you sue for essentially everyone in the state, alleging billions of dollars in damages. The key reason this is so important to this scheme, of course, is because this is a break-the-company lawsuit. By that I mean it's an existential threat to the existence of this company, far bigger than any legal threat they may have faced in the past, because the damages are enormous. And every potential juror that would sit in judgment of the case, being a constituent of that state, would stand to benefit in some way or another from any judgment rendered against this company. And, of course, there's the power of the state itself to launch perhaps a negative publicity campaign against this company or sector and erode the value, the stock value of this company in order to compel them or force them into a settlement posture. Well, part of this scheme is that even though the chances of winning in court are very slim, even a small risk of losing everything, wiping out shareholders, retirees, pension funds, and employees, that even that small risk is enough to cause the defendant to consider coming to the settlement table. And true that even if you have a chance, liability is very thin and you think that you aren't responsible, that you still have to navigate the maze of litigation through the trial and the appellate and the Supreme Court. And you know, you might just win if they can outlast their adversaries. But in the meantime, as I indicated earlier, the stock price takes a beating. Management is consumed with defending the lawsuit rather than running the business, and millions of dollars are being spent on their own lawyers in order to defend this case. Well, in this story, the law partners of this enterprising young lawyer say, that sounds like a great plan. We could earn a lot of money. To which the lawyer proposing this says, well, we can earn more than you can possibly imagine because our compensation may well exceed $100,000 an hour. Well, how do you do that? No one can charge $100,000 an hour as a legal fee. Well, this is the best part from their perspective. They won't actually negotiate an hourly fee under the supervision of a judge that reflects prevailing ethical standards. Instead, they'll negotiate a deal with this Attorney General for the state on a contingency fee basis in a no-bid, non-competitive contract. And so then they would get a percentage of any amount of money recovered in this bet the company lawsuit. And since there are no costs up front for the taxpayer, the state attorney general would look like a hero even if the lawsuit was unsuccessful. But if he succeeds, these lawyers would get a significant percentage of an astronomical sum of money. No funds would be appropriated by the legislature to finance the litigation, so the state official can make the ethically fallacious and ethically dubious claim that no tax dollars would be used to pay legal fees. The official enters this no-bid contract for legal services from lawyers whose future political support, including campaign contributions, is assured. And the official can expect to be lauded as a popular hero in the press by his willingness to take on an unpopular industry. Now, as part of this scheme and story to leverage the chances for success, these lawyers then cherry-pick the court where the lawsuit is filed, a court well known for being friendly to these sorts of claims. And seeing the handwriting on the wall, ultimately, as part of this scheme, the plan would be that the defendants, even though they're not, the chances of proving them responsible are very thin, the risk of losing losing the company are so huge that they decide to go to the settlement table. Well, here's the deal, these plaintiffs' lawyers say, under this scheme. And in some ways, it turns out to be a lifeline to the defendants. First, the good news. The defendants will survive. They won't be at risk of losing the company, the employees, the stock price, the pensioners, the retirees who depend on the existence of the company. Secondly, the business will continue to operate. And here's the best part. The judgment that will be entered will ultimately, from the standpoint of the company, ultimately bar any future lawsuits. And the defendants agree, rather than paying a lump sum settlement out of their current assets, to pay hundreds of billions of dollars to these lawyers and the state out of future profits. Well, how do you make sure you don't have to dip into your current assets? Well, basically, the defendants agree under this arrangement to raise the price of their product for consumers. So, ultimately, the consumers pay. And the defendants will pay the attorney's fees out of this same income stream. Now, these lawyers in this story believe this is really a stroke of genius. While no person who has allegedly been injured by this product will receive a penny, and indeed, as a result, the defendant will not be deterred from engaging in that sort of conduct, nor will, as I say, any victim be compensated, the state recovers a windfall of damages without having to appear to raise taxes, although the increased price for the product is passed along to consumers. Well, as a result of this deal, the defendant's stock price rebounds. They can stay in business essentially as a partner with this law firm whose legal fees will be paid out of future sales revenue, and the state official that agrees to this ingenious scheme is elected to higher office in part on the strength of this David versus Goliath story. The only problem with this story, Mr. President, is that it is no fairy tale. So who are these lawyers who dreamed up this ingenious scheme to partner with a state official to be able to be delegated the sovereign power of the state and collect fabulous wealth in the form of attorney's fees that no judge will award and no jury will award because it's part of this settlement? Well, Jack McConnell, the nominee, and his law firm, whose website says McConnell played a central role in the historic litigation against the tobacco industry, in which $246 billion in all was recovered. It says, on behalf of the state attorneys general, he served as a negotiator and primary drafter of the master settlement agreement. As a result, Mr. McConnell told us in the Judiciary Committee he expects to collect between $2.5 and $3.1 billion a year from now through 2024. And what's more, Jack McConnell now finds himself nominated to be a federal judge in whose court future ingenious but ethically dubious schemes can be expected to have a warm reception. Mr. President, this is the type of thing that Stuart Taylor, a well-respected legal commentator, called, he said, the rule of law has now morphed under these sorts of schemes into the rule of lawyers. He's talked about the sequel to this litigation I've described in this story, which was the lead paint lawsuit, which we've talked about a little before, which was unanimously rejected by the Rhode Island Supreme Court, frivolous litigation. Matter of fact, Mr. McConnell and his law firm were assessed fees of over $200,000. But Mr. Taylor said it's litigation of this type which has perverted the legal system for personal or political gain at the expense of everyone else. Strong words, hard words. But I think the Senate needs to know the type of nominee that we're voting on, and the American people need to know what the record of this nominee is, so then they can hold the senators who vote for his confirmation accountable. But this isn't a partisan issue. It really isn't. This isn't even about ideology. This is about ethics. This is about upholding the rule of law. Well, Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent to, after the close of my remarks, to make part of the record a Wall Street Journal article, January 12, 2000, by Robert B. Reich.
Without objection.
Mr. President, Mr. Reich was Secretary of Labor during the Clinton administration, and he wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal that I think is particularly appropriate to what I'm talking about. The head of the lead of the article from this prominent Democrat, member of Cabinet Secretary under Bill Clinton, is, "Don't Democrats believe in democracy?" That's the title. And I won't read all of it, but I will read just a few sentences. In talking about this kind of government-sponsored litigation by outsourcing the responsibilities of the sovereign government and the elected officials to contingency fee lawyers whose only motive is maximizing their personal profit, he said, the biggest problem is that these lawsuits are end runs around the democratic process. He says, we used to be a nation of laws, but this new strategy presents a novel means of legislating within settlement negotiations of large civil lawsuits initiated by the executive branch. This is faux legislation, which sacrifices democracy to the discretion of administration officials operating in secrecy. Well, I agree with Secretary Reich. I think this is a threat to our democracy. Again, I don't think it should be viewed as a partisan issue, even though he has that provocative headline, and he's talking about members of his own party who have endorsed and initiated some of this type of litigation. We had an earlier vote as I said, where 63 senators voted to close off debate, and we will have a vote here in short order. And I know some senators have indicated that they voted to close off debate because they felt that was the appropriate vote to make, but they were going to vote against Mr. McConnell's nomination. So we'll see how many votes he gets, but we know if it's a party line vote, there's 53 Democrats in this body and 47 Republicans. If it's a party line vote, Mr. McConnell's going to be a federal judge. But I think it is important to make the record crystal clear as to the type of nominee that senators are voting on. I think it's my responsibility to my constituents, it's my responsibility to the Senate to express the strong objections I have to this nominee. Surely, well, I know there are better people for the President to nominate in Rhode Island. 2 of them serve in the U.S. Senate here. I mean, there are other people, qualified people, who could be nominated. And I just believe that this ethically challenged nominee, who has, according to the words of Stuart Taylor, perverted, among a class of lawyers who perverted the legal system for personal and political gain at the expense of everyone else, is the wrong person for this job. And so I will be voting against the nomination. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that remaining time post-cloture be yielded back and the Senate proceed to vote on the confirmation of the nomination of John J. McConnell, Jr. to be the U.S. District Judge for the District of Rhode Island. That the motion be reconsidered. The motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motions be in order to the nomination, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, the Senate then resume legislative session and proceed to a period of morning business for debate only until 7:30 p.m., with Senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. Question is on the nomination. Yeas and nays called for. Is there sufficient second? There is. Appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus.
Mr. President.
Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons.
That's what John said. He'll make that between.
Mr. Corker.
He was the lead on the
Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed, Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Chester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner.
It's like
Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baucus, Bennett, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Brown of Ohio, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Conrad, Coons, Durbin, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Inouye, Johnson of South Dakota, Kerry, Klobuchar, Cole, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Webb, Whitehouse, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown of Massachusetts, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Dement, Enzi, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Hoeven, Hutchison, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Kyle, Lee, Lugar, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Hall, Portman, Risch, Rubio, Sessions, Shelby, Snow, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, Wicker. Mr. Lieberman, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, aye.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or to change their vote? If not, the yeas are 50, the nays are 44. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table. The President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions, and the Senate will resume legislative session. Under the previous order, the Senate is now in a period of morning business for debate only until 7:30 p.m., with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa.
I asked to speak for a much longer period of time, so...
Senate will be in order. Senator will suspend.
Am I going... Mr. President, I'd like to ask permission to speak for 45 minutes. I may not use all that time, but I'd like to have permission to speak that long. Yes.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Okay. Mr. President, it's not going to surprise any of my colleagues or the public at large that a lot of times I come to the Senate floor to speak about agriculture and to speak about ethanol. And what brings me to the floor today is the ongoing crusade by the Wall Street Journal to, in an intellectually dishonest way, put out a lot of facts about ethanol that are not true. And the latest barrage comes from an interview that was last Saturday in the Wall Street Journal, interview with C. Larry Pope, CEO of Smithfield's Food. In this article, there's a lot of misstatements about ethanol and about ethanol causing the price of food to rise dramatically. And I take the floor now to rebut some of those misstatements and also to set the record straight so that when a very fine CEO like Mr. Pope, even though I disagree with him on this article, he is a decent person and he is a good corporate executive. But so next time he speaks, he won't speak. But I can also say that I don't like to have confrontations with Smithfield Food because they do provide a lot of good-paying jobs in the Middle West, and they do a good job of adding value to agriculture and things of that nature. But there's been a tradition within Smithfields to kind of not really appreciate American agriculture. And it goes back to some conversations I had with a previous CEO by the name of Joe Luter. And I remember Joe Luter coming to my office to tell me some things, try to explain to me some things that he thought I had some misinterpretation of what he was really talking about the family farmer and about the production of hogs and whether or not he was wanting to put the family farmer out of business. But I remember very, just as if it was said to me yesterday, a statement he made when I said, you know, you're running the family farmer, the family producer, the independent producer out of the hog business, and you want to control everything. And he said to me something along the lines that I don't want to put your farmers out of business. I just want them feeding my pigs. So he was basically saying that he wanted the family farmer to be a employee of Smithfield and not be really an independent producer. Another thing that he tried to argue with me, and I'm referring to Mr. Pope's predecessor, Mr. Luter, he also argued that Iowa farmers, in a sense, weren't smart enough to run a packing plant, and in fact he offered to give a plant to a group of farmers and guaranteed that it would be out of business within 6 months. So I don't know whether I have fault with Mr. Pope as CEO of Smithfield and ethanol in this case, as opposed to Luter and who's going to raise pigs in the case of his predecessor, Mr. Luter. But there may be an institutional bias within the corporation of Smithfield. So anyway, with that as background, I want to go to this article that I pointed out was in the Wall Street Journal. The article says it's getting harder to bring home the bacon. Basically what he's saying in that headline, or the paper is saying in that headline, is that we're raising the price of corn because so much corn is used for ethanol that it's driving up the price of food. And I'm on the floor to say that that's a bunch of hogwash. This article was in the April 30th edition of the Wall Street Journal. So if people want to read it and check it with what I've got to say, I'm happy to do that. The article was based on an interview with C. Larry Pope, CEO of Smithfield Foods, the largest pork producer and the largest pork processor. The opinion piece was intended to share Mr. Pope's view on rising food prices and also on the price of pork. Mr. Pope puts much of the blame on the federal ethanol program. I'd like to address a number of the claims made by Mr. Pope and claims made in the opinion piece, presumably based on statements by Mr. Pope. Mr. Pope claims, and I quote, "Now 40% of the corn crop is directed to ethanol." I want to start that quote over again. Now 40% of the corn crop is directed to ethanol, which equals the amount that's going into livestock food. Well, right there, statistically, he's wrong. Let me point out how he's wrong. In 2010, 4.65 billion bushels of corn were used to produce 13 billion gallons of ethanol. But ethanol production uses only the starch from a corn kernel. So I want to hold up a bag of corn kernels. It'd be better if I'd bring in an ear of corn, but this is the best way to transport it. These are corn. Now, when ethanol uses only the starch from the corn kernel, the result is that more than 1/3, or 1 4/10 billion bushels of corn, and it's called dried distiller's grain, and this is what dried distiller's grain is, was available as a high-value livestock feed. In fact, what's left over after you produce ethanol really is of much more value than if you take the original kernel kernels and use that by itself for animal feed. So then I want to say, when he says go back to that quote, now 40% of the corn crop is directed to ethanol, which equals the amount that's going into livestock food. Well, then on a net basis now, ethanol production used only 23% of the U.S. corn crop, far less than the 40% that ethanol detractors claim. So once again, you have a bushel of corn, 56 pounds. Out of that 56 pounds of corn, you get 2 8/10 bushels of ethanol. When you get done making the ethanol, you've got 18 pounds of dried distiller grain that's left over, that I don't think anybody that's ignorant about ethanol understands that there's still a food product left over. And so you can't say that you're making ethanol out of corn and using it all for ethanol and nothing for food, because this is a very efficient production. And by the way, let me say this. You can tell about the ignorance of ethanol in this town because a lot of people pronounce it ethanol, and that's E-E-E-T-H-A-N-O-L, ethanol. It's ethanol. But people that are ignorant about it don't even know how to pronounce it. And I don't know whether Mr. Pope pronounced it right or not. According to the USDA, feed use consumes 37% of the U.S. corn supply, much more than the 23% consumed by ethanol production. So I hope Mr. Pope will put that in his pipe and smoke it, because he's wrong on that point. Ethanol is not diverting corn away from feed use. Next, Mr. Pope claims, and I quote, ethanol policy has impacted the world price of corn. I'm glad Mr. Pope raised this issue. He clearly has no idea how little an impact ethanol has on global grain market. In fact, U.S. ethanol use represents a mere 3% of the world's supply of coarse grain. In addition, the global grain supply in 2010 to 2011 is 11% larger than in 2000 to 2001 supply. U.S. farmers happen to be the most productive in the world. Since 1975, American farmers have doubled U.S. corn production from under 6 billion bushels to over 12 billion bushels last year. And they've done it using essentially the same number of acres. Corn farmers today grow 5 times as much corn as they did in 1930 on 20% less land. So for all these people out there that think that there isn't enough productivity in the American farmer or in our land or in the efficiency of producing, I hope you understand that we're producing 5 times more corn than we did in 1930, but doing it on 20% less land. Or let me explain it another way. In 1910, you know what powered agriculture? Horses and mules. And in that day, it took 90 million acres of land just to grow the food that the animals that powered agriculture used to stay alive and to be productive animals and the power for agriculture. That 90 million acres is equal almost to the 92 million acres that will be planted to corn in the United States this year. Farmers are continuing to meet the growing demand, then, of ethanol, livestock feed, and exports. So I hope that Mr. Pope will put that in his pipe and smoke it, because he needs to understand how productive the American grain farmer is. The author of the opinion piece then makes a claim that has absolutely no basis in fact. So I guess I can't attribute this to Mr. Pope. It states that, quote, the EPA has found ethanol production has a neutral to negative impact on the environment. Well, I've always said that ethanol is good for the environment. But here we got EPA being quoted that it's a negative impact on the environment. Neutral to negative impact on the environment. The fact is, under the renewable fuel standard created in 2007, corn ethanol was required to reduce greenhouse gas emissions compared to gasoline by at least 20%. Corn ethanol has exceeded that threshold. In other words, the law says such and such, and ethanol exceeds what the law even requires. A reduction of more than 20% compared to gasoline is not neutral. So EPA has found ethanol production has neutral to negative impact on the environment. Not so. If you remove EPA's use of murky science surrounding emissions from what is called indirect land use, and that's kind of complicated, so I won't go into that, ethanol reduces greenhouse gas emissions by 48% compared to gasoline. Now, I've heard senators in the last 2 months on the floor of the United States Senate telling all of us that ethanol was bad for the environment. A recent peer-reviewed study published by Yale Journal of Industrial Ecology. Now, all the Ivy League people in the Senate ought to have some allegiance to anything done by Yale University. This is what that Yale Journal said, that ethanol reduces greenhouse gas emissions by up to 59% compared to gasoline. Mr. Pope also asserts that Pilgrim Pride went bankrupt because of ethanol. Pilgrim Pride was a food processor. He stated, quote, "The largest chicken processor in the United States, Pilgrim's Pride, filed for bankruptcy. They couldn't raise prices, so their cost of production went up dramatically," end of quote. Again, facts are stubborn things. On December 1st, 2008, analysts cited the primary cause of bankruptcy was their large debt load, the result of the acquisition of $1 3/10 billion rival, the result of a $1 3/10 billion rival that they purchased in 2007. Other factors included low chicken demand and prices resulting from the recession and poor commodity hedging, but not anything about the price of ethanol and corn production being high. So I hope that Mr. Pope will put that in his pipe and smoke it. Another statement by Mr. Pope seems to place all the blame on corn farmers for rising food prices. He said, quote, "You eat eggs, you drink milk, you get a loaf of bread, and you get a pound of meat. All of those are based on grain." Now, that last part of that statement's accurate, but let me tell you what's wrong with the relationship between rising food prices and the price of grain. Now, let's look at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The food value of every food dollar is 19 cents. In other words, if you spend $1 on food at the supermarket, only 19 cents of that goes into the pocket of the farmer. And of those 19 cents, the corn value of that farmer income is 3 cents. So let's look at some of these prices. You buy a box of corn flakes, 12.9 ounce. 5 6/10 cents go to a farmer if corn's 4 bushel an acre, or $4 a bushel. And if corn's $6 a bushel, it goes, the farmer gets 8 6/10 cents out of a whole package of corn flakes. Soft drinks, $4 a bushel, the farmer gets 6.6 cents. If it's $6 a bushel, he gets 10 cents. Beef, farmer gets 18.2 if at the low end of corn prices, 27 8/10 cents at the higher end. Now, I could go on with pork and chicken and turkey and eggs and milk, but the point is, don't blame the farmer when you buy a box of corn flakes, because the farmer gets a little over a nickel, or at most, if corn's higher price, 8 6/10 cents. So the farmer gets 19 cents in a global way. Corn only gets 3 cents out of $1 of food that you buy. The other 81 cents of that dollar goes to labor, goes to energy, goes to transportation, going to marketing, and going to packaging. The World Bank in 2008 stated that biofuels were a large contributor to rising food prices. And you know what? 2 years later, they released a more thorough analysis in 2010 that essentially dismissed the idea. So I want to quote from the World Bank report, quote, "The effect of biofuels on food prices has not been as large as originally thought. and that, continuing to quote, the use of commodities by financial investors may have been partly responsible for the 2007-2008 spike, end of quote. So, for Mr. Pope, I hope he'll put that in his pipe and smoke it, because he's wrong about the amount of corn and the price of corn and the impact on food prices, and the World Bank dismisses that as well. We even have the United Kingdom. Let's say, I like to say Great Britain instead of United Kingdom, but their Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs concluded in 2010 that, quote, available evidence suggests that biofuels had a relatively small contribution to the 2008 spike in agricultural commodity prices. In 2009, the Congressional Budget Office evaluated the increasing demand for corn to produce ethanol on food prices. They estimated that, maybe I better start with a 5 1/10% increase in food prices for the year 2009. Now, of that 5 1/10%, just 0.5, or I better say 0.5%, between that and 0.8%, I better say it more accurately, we got 5 1/10 percentage points increase in food prices. Only 0.5% and maybe up to 0.8 percentage points of that 5 1/10% was due to the demand for ethanol. And about 10% of just the increased price of food was because of ethanol. In 2007, Informa Economics concluded that, quote, it is statistically unsupported to suggest that high and or rising corn prices are the causative reason behind high and rising retail meat, egg, and milk products. Another point raised in this article by Mr. Pope needs to be addressed. He said, quote, over the last several years, the cost of corn has gone from a base of $2.40 a bushel, today $7.40 a bushel. While true, this all needs to be put in context. Over that same period of time, crude oil prices went from $50 a barrel to nearly $150 a barrel, and today are over $110 a barrel. Gold prices went from $500 an ounce to over $1,500 an ounce today. Mr. Pope would rather pay $2.40 a bushel for corn rather than $7.40. I understand that. But does he know what impact that would have on agriculture? If corn were only $2.40 a bushel, every farmer today would be out of business because the cost of production is around $4 a bushel. Oh, I can see. He wants the farmers to subsidize Smithfield if he wants to continue getting corn for $2.40 a bushel. But a farmer can't subsidize the big corporations. Perhaps Mr. Pope would rather have us through government subsidies so long as they'd allow him to buy corn below the cost of production. And I can tell you this, a lot of people say, well, ethanol is the reason corn prices are high. It might be part of the reason. But let's suppose you didn't have any ethanol and you had $2.40 a bushel for corn. You know darn well that a lot more would be coming out of the Treasury to make sure that the safety net for the family farmer was working than we give for an ethanol subsidy. Now, regardless, at $7.40 a bushel, the corn cost in a gallon of milk is about 46 cents. The cost of corn in a pound of chicken is about 34%. 1 pound of beef takes about 92 cents worth of corn. And relative to Smithfield, because they're big in pork, 1 pound of pork requires about 39 cents of corn. So if that $4.54 a pound for bacon in the grocery aisle contains only 39 cents worth of corn, perhaps Mr. Pope should explain to all of us, and most importantly to people that buy it, the consumer, where the other $404.15 or 91% of the retail cost is going. In addition, after the steep rise in commodities in 2008, prices of corn and other commodities retreated very significantly. I don't recall seeing from people like Smithfield that when corn was $7 3 years ago and it went down to $3.58, I didn't see a very dramatic drop in prices at the grocery store after the corn prices dropped, which leads me, like I've so often said on the floor of the Senate, that these food processors need to scapegoat something to increase the price of their product to the retailer and the consumer. And then when the price goes down, they've increased their price, but the price doesn't go down accordingly. Mr. Pope claims rising corn prices are hurting his business. He said rising prices are already squeezing food producers 2 to 3% earnings margins. That's his quote. The statement is rather surprising, given the contradictory earning report for Smithfield's Food that came out March the 10th, 2011. Smithfield reported net income for the quarter of $202 million, an increase of $165 million over the same quarter in 2010. Mr. Pope stated at the time of the earnings report, quote, "We are extremely pleased with the record performance of our company in the third quarter. Year to date, our earnings have surpassed that of our record year." The reality of Smithfield's record profits failed to validate the rhetoric. According to the article, and here I'm quoting the article and not Mr. Pope, Smithfield's economists estimate corn prices would fall by $1 a bushel if ethanol blending wasn't subsidized. Well, I guess if it's Smithfield's economists, it must be coming directly from the company then. Smithfield may want to invest then in better economists. According to an April 2011 study issued by the Center for Agriculture and Rural Development at Iowa State University, only 14 cents, or 8%, of the increase in corn prices from 2006 to 2009 was due to ethanol subsidies. The study also found that without the ethanol subsidy, corn prices would have averaged only 4% less over the same period of time. Finally, the article calls into question the value of ethanol to our nation's energy supply. It states, quote, "The ethanol industry would supply only 4% of the nation's annual energy needs, even if it used 100% of the corn crop." This is a straw man. No one is arguing that ethanol will replace our nation's entire energy needs. Using just 23% of the corn crop, we're displacing nearly 10% of our nation's foreign oil dependence. Domestic ethanol production ranks behind only the United States and Canadian oil production in terms of domestic transportation fuel supply. It's obvious that Saturday's opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal was just another coordinated effort to undermine and scapegoat homegrown ethanol and America's corn farmers to help deflect criticism from big food producers. Make no mistake, Smithfield's CEO Larry Pope is concerned with only one thing, Smithfield's bottom line. While companies like Smithfield perpetuate a smear campaign to boost their profits, American farmers and alternative fuel producers are working hard to produce a reliable and safe supply of food, fiber, and feed for the nation and the world. That's the end of my reaction to what he said, Mr. Hope said. But I would like to just end by saying that the marketplace will take care of this. You know, 30 years ago when we started an ethanol program, we produced about 100 bushel of corn to the acre on average. Today, nationally, I think it's about 155 bushel of corn to the acre. In Iowa, it's probably about 168, and the year before it was 182. People that are experts in genetics can say that we'll be able to double the production of corn over the next 50 years. That's one way that we can solve this problem. The other way is that there's a massive amount of land, a lot of places in this earth, and a great part of it is in West Africa, South Africa, and parts of East Africa, where if people would establish law guaranteeing property rights, title to land, there wouldn't be governmental disincentives to growing food, there wouldn't be a cheap food policy, there would be a massive production of foodstuff in this world. And in the United States, we're going to continue to produce more. There's going to be 4 million more acres of corn grown this year than last year. And there's even some odd things being done because the price of corn is $7. From the Des Moines Register, this headline from a northern small community of Iowa. The Whittemore Golf Club, the golf course is going to be plowed up and planted to corn. So there's some extreme measures that are being taken here to respond to the demand for food or fiber or fuel. And just remember, agriculture in America has the capability and the demonstrated capability to produce all. We don't grow food or we don't grow crops just for food. We've always grown for food and fiber. And for the last 30 years, food, fiber, and fuel. And we can continue to do it, and we're going to do it successfully, and the consumers of America aren't going to pay for it. In fact, if we don't continue to do that and keep the family farmer of the United States healthy and strong, and ethanol is a contribution to that, then we're not going to be able to meet the needs of our society. I yield the floor.